and we will be recording this. Just for folks who aren't able to join, it will be posted on our webpage later today. All right, so a few housekeeping items just before we get into it. Please use the Q&A function to ask all your questions. We'll try to get to that at the end. If there's something that we're not able to cover during the presentation, or we're not able to get to all of the questions that are asked, we will follow up later this week with a updated FAQ that is also posted on the webpage that will address all the questions asked here. The questions that were asked during last week's webinar have been posted with answers to the updated FAQ for that one. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I just want to check, Julia, you can see the presentation okay, correct?
Yep, looks great.
All righty. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the Large Building Decarbonization Showcase today, the funding opportunity. But before we dig into those details, I'll give you some context, where it came from, the policy, go over eligibility requirements, eligible costs, and then get into some QA with Alex before we open up for some questions from some folks online. All right, so if this is your first time interacting with the Colorado Energy Office, our mission is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and consumer energy costs by advancing clean energy, energy efficiency, and zero emissions vehicles to benefit all Coloradans. And the vision for the office is a prosperous, clean energy future for Colorado. So the state actually set a goal to achieve a 20% reduction in emissions by 2030 from large commercial, multifamily, and public buildings compared to 2021 levels. So this has really grounded all of our work on building electrification and building decarbonization, as identified in our roadmap, as well as our primary climate action plan. The state's Building Performance Colorado program built off of this goal. It includes benchmarking requirements for buildings, as well as the introduction of building performance standards for covered buildings under BPC, and is a critical part of meeting this reduction goal. So we'll talk a little bit more about BPC and BPS. So BPS, or building performance standards, are required for all covered buildings. So generally covered buildings are 50,000 square feet or greater, and they're required to achieve a reduction in either greenhouse gas emissions or site energy use intensity. So you'll see that we have two different pathways to achieving this goal. Buildings can select either the energy efficiency pathway, which they can achieve through a weather normalized site EUI property type target, or a standard % reduction from their baseline. Or what we're most interested in is that GHG intensity pathway. So choosing to achieve and be in compliance with BPS by being on the GHG reduction pathway can look like achieving your property type target, or again, that baseline standard % reduction. So for the climate pollution reduction grant for the Large Building Decarbonization Showcase, we are primarily interested in looking at this GHGI pathway, so reducing greenhouse gas reductions on site. And in order to achieve this GHG reduction and support BPS compliance, CEO was awarded a climate pollution reduction grant from EPA with about $35 million of those funds dedicated to building out this Large Building Decarb Showcase program. Funding under this program will be used to resource, accelerate, and share example solutions that cost effectively reduce large commercial, multifamily, and public building emissions on site. And so this program is aiming to achieve emissions reductions in large buildings that have selected that GHG reduction pathway by funding projects that are able to achieve their emissions reduction target before their deadline or beyond their selected target. So we're really looking for buildings that are able to exceed that BPS compliance in some way. So either exceeding it in the timeline of before 2030 target, or exceeding your target, whether that's your property type target or the standard % reduction. Other things to consider for eligibility. It's a pretty broad list of what is eligible, since a lot of it is predefined in BPC and what determines a covered building. But buildings eligible to receive funding are those that are considered covered buildings under BPC, but are also in good standing with all of the benchmarking reporting requirements and the fee requirements involved in BPC and being a covered building, and those buildings that have selected or plan to select a greenhouse gas reduction pathway for their building performance standard. So those are the three primary criteria for buildings to be eligible to apply. And that can look like several different property types. So it could be commercial office buildings, it could be private and nonprofit organizations, hospitals, eligible public buildings, multifamily buildings and HOAs, and other buildings approved by CEO in writing prior to submitting your application. So there is a little bit of a caveat in the eligible public buildings criteria. So public buildings are required to benchmark, so they have to submit their benchmarking data every year, but they are not required to comply with a building performance standard target until they trigger that requirement by completing a renovation that is either that is both $500,000 and impacts 25% of the building. So both of those things need to be met in order for the public building to have to comply with BPS targets and therefore be eligible to apply for funding. So we anticipate having at least 2 rounds of funding available. So we'll have round 1 that's open right now, and then we'll have round 2 coming later next year. But round 1 of our showcase is designed to maximize the emissions reduction potential and the cost effectiveness of awarded measures. So how much can you reduce and how effectively and efficiently can you use that funding to achieve that reduction? The selection of our awardees in this round is going to prioritize projects that are able to demonstrate a high level of readiness. So you're ready to get started, whether that's on planning or implementation costs, and leverage a significant amount of funding. So anywhere from 35 to 50% of the cost. So with CEO covering 50 to 65% of the costs. And then also demonstrate a commitment to achieving that EPS GHG reduction target is essential for this first round. Applicants in this round may apply for either planning phase or implementation phase costs based on the readiness level of your project. So we'll get into it a little bit later, but we'll have applications open for planning phase costs, so designing, building out that project, and then implementation phase costs if you're ready to go, everything's been designed. So the funding amounts by phase. For our planning phase for round 1, we anticipate $500,000 being available in total. And planning phase awards are going to be capped at 50% of identified planning phase costs with a maximum award of $50,000 per project. So we're looking at probably 10 awardees in this first phase, and no additional planning phase funds will be available. It's important to note also that planning phase awardees are required to apply for the next implementation phase funding round in summer of 2026. This is something that will be scored as part of the application of whether that planning phase applicant has a high likelihood of moving on to the implementation phase. If they're able to demonstrate both readiness to execute on planning and a commitment to move forward to implementation, both in like securing finances necessary to move forward, or having the project timeline built out already. So it's important to keep in mind that if you are awarded a planning phase award, you will have to move forward and submit an implementation phase application as well. For round 1 of our implementation phase, we will have $10 million available. And the number of grants is a little bit flexible here. So applicants can request funding for up to 50% of the costs associated with the purchase, labor, and installation of equipment, with a maximum award of $2 million per project. So if we award projects the max that we can, we're looking at maybe 5 total awardees in this round. Buildings that are identified as under-resourced buildings for the program definition can request up to 65% of the costs associated, but still with that same award cap of $2 million per project. An under-resourced building, as defined by the program, are buildings that can demonstrate any of the criteria outlined in the BPC technical resource guide. So any of that really hard financial hardship that's outlined there, or any of the following criteria. So any of the below can help a building identify as under-resourced, and that can look like more than 50% of the property is income restricted for a defined period of time, utilized as affordable housing with a maximum income requirement of 80% of the area median income. If the property is owned and managed by a tax exempt organization or is a small business with less than 100 employees. Buildings that are owned by an organization that provides human services and are also regulated by DHS. If the property is located in a rural area, demonstrated by having either 50,000 or less residents or a population density of 10% or less. Or lastly, if the property serves and is located in a low-income community as determined by the Colorado Department of Health and the Environment EnviroScreen tool. So in the RFA materials, this is located there, and then also a link to that EnviroScreen tool to help determine if you are in a low-income community. Eligible costs by phase for this round. So the planning phase, eligible costs here can include, but are not limited to, anything related to the design and planning of a project. So it can look like electrical design, mechanical design, engineering, an energy audit that is an ASHRAE level 2, and then associated administrative costs. Planning phase awardees will also receive additional technical assistance provided from the Energy Office through an emissions reduction assessment. So this emissions reduction assessment, or ERA, will be part of that award, but not contribute to that total award amount. In the implementation phase, costs here are a little bit more broad. So there's a lot of different projects, a lot of different combination of projects that can result in emissions on site. And if you are able to connect your proposed project with emissions reductions on site, we would love to see it. There are some disallowed costs that we'll get into, but eligible costs can look like the electrification of fossil fuel-based heating or water heating systems, the installation of high-efficiency electric equipment for HVAC or heating systems, any efficiency or electrification upgrades as identified in that emissions reduction assessment, the installation of renewable energy or storage on site, and then other innovative demonstrations of decarbonization in buildings. So if you can connect it to decarbonization and to achieving your GHG reduction target, and it's not on the disallowed cost, we would love to see that demonstration. So we briefly touched on emissions reduction assessments and how they'll be provided to planning phase awardees. And this is something that we are going to require all of our implementation phase applicants to submit. And so to better understand the total reduction potential of a building and how that selected equipment or proposed equipment plays a role, we are asking applicants to the implementation phase to complete and submit an emissions reduction assessment using the Department of Energy provided scope of work and checklist. And so applicants will receive that, or awardees of the planning phase will receive an ERA provided by CEO at no cost. And that will be part of their submission for that implementation round next summer. Getting into the disallowed costs by planning phase. So any geothermal feasibility studies, test wells, an ASHRAE level 1 audit, those are not things that will be allowed in the planning phase. And then in the implementation phase, so any upgrades to the building envelope, including but not limited to windows, insulation, roof upgrades, any equipment that relies primarily on a fossil fuel source, the purchase of renewable energy credits or any off-site renewable energy development, the abatement of hazards uncovered during construction. So that can look like lead, mold, asbestos, other things that are often uncovered during the implementation phase of construction projects will not be eligible to receive funding. Aesthetic finishes or comfort upgrades not tied to GHG reduction. So again, if the measure that you're proposing cannot be directly tied to a reduction in greenhouse gases on site, we will not consider it for funding. And then, any equipment or infrastructure upgrades that can't be tied to the ERA or to achieving the BPS target. All right, so now that we've gotten through that, how do you actually apply? So starting tomorrow on September 30th, interested applicants can email myself requesting an application folder. I'll share with you a folder where you can drop all of your completed materials, the narrative, the budget, all those other required application pieces into the folder that I send. And just a reminder that implementation phase applications do require a completed emissions reduction assessment to be considered complete. Once all those materials are in there and you've gone through the checklist that's available for both phases, send me an email to confirm that your materials are ready for review and can be accessed in the folder. And then the round will close on November 3rd of 2025. So all applicants will lose access to their application folders on that day, and then they'll go under review by our CEO review team. The review team will score applications separately. So we'll score all the planning phase applications against each other and all the implementation phase applications against each other using this scoring criteria here. The scoring criteria is broken out into more detail on our program webpage. So you can see for each category what we would be looking for to receive full points in each criteria. So for the planning phase, we're looking at a demonstration of need, a commitment to reduce greenhouse gases on site, your project partnerships, how ready the project is, when can it begin, and then looking at the project budget and schedule, as well as any risk mitigation. So identifying any risks to the project, and then how you will mitigate those risks that are identified. On the implementation phase, we'll look at many of the similar scoring criteria here. So similarly, looking at demonstration of need for the funds, also looking at project benefits that come with the project. So any co-benefits that can be anticipated in the implementation of the project, the actual GHG reduction potential from the implemented measures or the proposed measures in the project. Again, looking at the readiness and partnerships from the team, the project and schedule, looking at innovation here. So is this a new application of a technology? Is it a simplification of a technology? Is it maybe an interesting use in AI in building automation? And then taking another look at project risk mitigation here as well. Okay, so this funding is awarded to the office under EPA. And as federal funding, it does have some federal terms that come along with it. So I've highlighted a few here, but there are more that you should be aware of that are included in the RFA and available on our program webpage, but we'll go into detail on these just a little bit. So the first one that we want to make sure that we're aware of is Davis-Bacon and related acts. This is a collection of labor standards and provisions administered by the Department of Labor that are applicable to federal assistance agreements and all subawards. So all of our awardees under this program will be subrecipients and will have to follow and be in compliance with these acts and all of the federal standards. So the Davis-Bacon Act requires payment of prevailing wage rates for laborers and mechanics on construction contracts of $2,000 or more. So all of these implementation phase applications will have to follow and be in compliance with this requirement, as well as the Copeland Anti-Kickback Act, which prohibits a contractor or subcontractor from including an employee into giving up any part of the compensation. And then lastly, the Contract Work Hours and Safety Standards Act, which requires overtime wages to be paid for over 40 hours of work per week under contracts in excess of $100,000. So again, very likely that all of our projects here or awarded in the implementation phase will have to comply with this act. Secondly, we have Build America, Buy America, or BABA. So the selected awardees of the showcase will be required to comply with all of what's in this act. Primarily that BABA requires that all iron and steel construction materials and manufactured products used in federally funded infrastructure projects are produced in the United States. And so prior to application, we're asking that applicants ensure that any equipment, where possible, that are included in their project are compliant with this federal regulation. Next, the National Historic Preservation Act. And this applies to buildings that are 50 years of age or older. So all buildings that are built before or on 1975 will have to comply with this and go under review to make sure that their proposed scope of work isn't, damaging the historical or cultural importance of the building. And the state will be working with our state historic preservation officer to review all of our proposed projects and make sure that they're compliant. This is primarily a responsibility of the state, but it's important for applicants to know that, they should refrain from doing work that impacts the facade of a building or impacts the historic nature of the building. And then lastly, competition requirements. So all subrecipients have to follow procurement standards outlined in 2 CFR 200. And this includes that all selection of subcontractors has to be competitive. You have to have documentation of the competitive process if they're named in the application. And then if subcontractors aren't named in your application, that competitive process still has to occur after the award and will still require documentation at that time as well. Before we move on, Alex, is there anything else that you wanted to add on the QA pieces?
No, that's great.
Great, okay. There's also a few state contracting requirements and terms that apply specifically to this grant. So since we are eager to tie all of our dollars spent to GHG reduction, every grant that is awarded will have 5% of their total award retained until they're able to demonstrate achieving their target within 12 months of completion for the implementation phase. And then all applicants will also have a few other retainers. So if you're not in compliance with benchmarking requirements and fees, you may apply still. So if you're missing your benchmarking data from this past year, or you forgot to pay your fee from this past year, you can still apply, but 10% of the total award will be retained until you can come into compliance. So in the next reporting season, when reporting opens, you'll have to submit any previous year's data and pay any previous fees before that 10% can be unlocked. Similarly, if you haven't selected the GHG reduction target, or maybe if you've selected the EUI target, 10% will be retained until you switch that target, and be a pretty simple process again. So not too many hoops that you'll have to jump through to unlock that 10% either. For planning phase awards specifically, we'll have 20% of the total award retained until they're able to apply for that summer 2026 implementation phase. If for whatever reason planning phase awardees are not able to move forward and submit an application for that implementation phase, that 20% will continue to be retained until at least one measure identified in the emissions reduction assessment is completed. That doesn't necessarily have to be HVAC electrification or the larger measures that can result in decarbonization on site. It could look like, weatherproofing or working on insulation updates, things of that nature, or going through retro commissioning, rather than a full decarbonization project. Okay, so the timeline for moving forward. The RFA, all the application materials are currently available on the webpage. So we have the application templates, frequently asked questions documents, the scoring criteria, a whole host of context and resources on Building Performance Colorado, Building Performance Standards. All of those are available now on the program's webpage. And then we will accept applications starting tomorrow through November 3rd at 11:59 p.m. We'll host 4 office hours through the month of October. So weekly on Monday from 11:30 to 12:30, we'll host office hours where folks can come ask questions. We'll review any of the frequently asked questions as well. Give people an opportunity to ask them more specific questions if they didn't get a chance to submit them to the form. We are anticipating that all award notifications will be sent out by 12/19 of 2025. So before we head into the holidays, we'd like to get all those notices out to awardees so we can begin contracting. And then summer 2026 is when we'll open and announce round two. And round two, again, will just be open for implementation phase applications. We will not be offering any planning phase assistance at that time. Okay, so we'll take a few minutes and go over any questions that are in the Q&A. And if we don't get to all of your questions, if there's things that we need to maybe follow up with things internally, again, there will be an updated FAQ that's posted to the webpage with all the answers that we address here, and then any that we're not able to get to as well. Okay, so are we concerned that the federal administration is making more cuts? Are they able to rescind these funds? So this is a question that we've gotten a few times online in our FAQ, and then also here as well. So these funds are under contract with the federal, with EPA. So they are obligated to us. They are under contract. And we have frequent communication with our project officer. So we've gotten very lucky with the folks that we deal with at the EPA. And any update that we receive from them will be communicated. But as of right now, these funds are obligated and we have no reason to believe that they are not. If you select the GHG pathway but receive no funding from the grant, can you change the EUI pathway? So this is something that is currently with our legal team for answers on this specifically. We believe that yes, if you do change the GHG pathway but receive no funding from the grant, you can change back. I think perhaps the better option here is to continue on your current pathway. That way, if you're awarded funds, you will have to change. You have time within that contract to change your pathway before you can unlock that 10%. So you don't have to change and then change again if you're not awarded. Public buildings are eligible for funding, but they do have to have those BPS requirements triggered. So public buildings are required to benchmark yearly, but they are not required to comply with a BPS target until they've triggered that BPS target by completing a renovation that is both $500,000 in cost at least, and also at least impacts 25% of the total square footage. So once those two things happen, that triggers the building's BPS target, and then they would be eligible to receive funding by needing to comply with their target. Will nonprofits or public buildings who are budget limited receive priority points in the review process? So no, there is no criteria that weighs any budget limited or under-resourced buildings in any way. There is the demonstration of need criteria. So both the planning phase and the implementation phase, you are able to demonstrate, why this funding is important, why it's essential for this project. And that has a total weight of 10 points. So 10% of the total score will come from that demonstration of need. And that's where we'll score any limits to budget. But again, it's important to note that the grant does carry a significant leveraged funds requirement. So the CEO, our office, the grant is only able to cover 50 to 65% of the total cost. So 35 to 50% of the cost will have to come from the applying organization, whether that's through other tax credits or state funds or grants or financing options that they're able to pursue. How much will be available in the summer 2026 implementation round? That really depends on how much interest we receive in this round. But likely we will have 20 million set aside for folks who have previously been awarded a planning phase grant, and then 5 million set aside for new applicants to the program for implementation. Can applications include multiple GHG reduction projects on the same building? Yes, absolutely. So we would love to see projects that include multiple different measures or projects that are able to, in combination, achieve that BPS target. So we don't expect any one measure to be able to achieve that BPS reduction target. So demonstrating and connecting how multiple measures are able to be layered and stacked to achieve compliance is definitely eligible project type. All applicants are needed to complete and submit an emissions reduction assessment, but the awardees will have this covered. So there are two phases. There's planning phase and implementation phase. In order to apply for the implementation phase, for the equipment purchase, cost and installation, you have to submit a completed emissions reduction assessment. However, if you are applying to the planning phase, as part of that planning phase cost and activity, an emissions reduction assessment will be provided by the Energy Office's selected contractor. And there's more detail on the specific breakout of both of those phases, how they work together, how the emissions reduction assessment is completed and provided on the webpage and the RFA. So if you go to the Large Building Decarbonization Showcase webpage and scroll down to the RFA, there's a section specifically on the two phases and then on the emissions reduction assessment piece. Okay, so if you are slotted to complete a remodel within 3 years, did you wait until that remodel project to apply? So all implementation phase awards and awardees will have to complete their project within 12 months of being under contract. So it sounds like if your project is more than a year away, then you would not be eligible to receive funding just because you would likely not score well in that readiness portion and the ability to meet the contract requirements. The disallowed costs have not been identified yet for round two. But in the same way where the RFA was posted a few weeks previous to opening and accepting applications, we'll do the same for that round. So in early summer, we will send out the RFA and any updates will be included there for disallowed costs. But I can tell you right now that planning phase costs will be disallowed. We will only be awarding implementation phase costs in round two. Okay, someone says that they struggled with how to feasibly comply with BABA in the past for equipment and grants like this. And if they're trying to improve HVAC efficiency, how can they reasonably ensure equipment is made in America? Alex, you want to take that one?
Yes. Yes, so there are a lot of BABA waivers built in. So if you think that it is not made in America or it's unfeasible, that is something we could help to get. So there are some exemptions.
Yeah, and we're working with our project officer at the EPA to understand the waiver process and what could apply to our program. Since we know that there's a lot of issues, it can be a little difficult to source some of this equipment in the US, or it can be a financial barrier to having the project move forward if you have to source in the US. So that's something that we're aware of and working with our EPA team to figure out how to best move forward. So that way we're in compliance with our federal award requirements. All of our awardees are in compliance as subrecipients, but we're still able to get projects off the ground and going. So we will be conducting office hours virtually. So that should be posted on the RFA webpage as well. And we'll go over questions very similar to this every Monday, 11:30 to 12:30 from now until October 27th. Then we have a question on if they can request indirect costs to adhere to administrative requirements.
No, so indirect costs are not an eligible cost. It's not allowed. You can, however, add in direct costs that would cover this administrative. So you can add in like a general contractor, an admin to manage the subcontractors. That is an allowable cost, but you cannot have indirects.
Cool, okay. Are buildings required to show ASHRAE level 2 audit information if applying for the implementation phase grant? So this is not a explicit requirement of the grant. So we're not requiring any technical documentation. However, it is listed as a way to show readiness or to show the GHG reduction potential on site. So an ASHRAE level 2 audit can be used as a supporting document to help improve your score in that criteria. Would a hotel be eligible property type for the planning phase? Yes, so a hotel definitely eligible property type for the planning phase, as long as you are a covered building under PC, and you have or plan to select that greenhouse gas reduction target, and are in compliance or have the ability to be in compliance during the next reporting season, you would be eligible to apply. Okay, our campus is eligible to apply. So is it okay if the campus is covered in over 50,000 square feet, but you are only using funds for a subset of buildings that are smaller? So this is where it gets a little tricky with BPS and campuses. If the buildings themselves are covered and this helps achieve a BPS target. So if this project can be connected to achieving a BPS target in a building or in multiple buildings, then we would consider the application eligible. I know that's a little vague, but we will follow up with additional information in the FAQ. And I think there may be additional information in the FAQ about campuses specifically or about thermal energy networks for campuses in achieving compliance. Will our team help with procurement of equipment that meets BABA standards like heat pumps? So we can't help with the actual procurement process. But again, like Alex mentioned, we will work on getting additional waiver information to potential applicants.
We can also help determine if a piece of equipment is BABA or eligible, or if there's a waiver eligible, or so we can help with that determination, but we cannot help with the actual procurement of anything.
Yeah, that's a good point. So as we go through our award and selection process, for all of our awardees, if you've included elements that are maybe not necessarily in compliance with BABA or might need a waiver, we will identify that, work with you on that end of it. Okay. Do you see many applicants using consulting firms to apply for this grant, or should the applications come directly from building owners? If the former, are there firms that CEO recommends, does not recommend? So for that last question, we cannot provide any recommendations on consulting firms or any other partnerships that you should use or pursue for the grant or any other reason. But it is, applications may be prepared for building owners through consulting firms or energy service companies or other organizations that can prepare the application on behalf of the building owner. For these applications, though, we do require that they submit a building owner property owner consent form. So that lets us know that whoever's preparing the application has done so with the approval of the actual property owner themselves. For the planning phase, you need to wait until 12/19 to begin any planning efforts. This is actually a really good question that will address, beginning planning phase and implementation phase efforts. So for all measures that are awarded, whether it's in the planning phase or in the implementation phase, that work cannot begin. So costs cannot be incurred, work cannot begin until you are under contract. So not have a award in hand, not receive a notice of award from us, but not until you are under contract. So until you've signed a contract agreement between the energy office and the receiving organization, work cannot begin. Any work that begins in that period, so between 12/19 to likely February of 2026, will be ineligible, and we will not be able to reimburse those costs. Okay, then we have a question on public building construction or renovation and whether the project needs to have been started and completed since October 15th, or just completed after October 15th, 2023, meaning it started prior. So that's a question that we're also asking our legal team just to make sure that we give you the correct answer, since it does relate to compliance. And so we'll follow up in an updated FAQ once we have that information. Are privately owned for-profit climate controlled commercial warehouses eligible? So if you are a BPC covered building, so if you've been identified and you don't meet any of those exclusions of being 50% or more of mixed use or manufacturing or agriculture or industrial use, and you have to benchmark and select a target for BPS, then you are eligible to apply. Outside of the office hours offered, are there other application support resources available? So that will be our only time in office hours to meet with folks, to ask questions. Because this is such a competitive grant, we want everyone to have equal opportunity to hear questions and hear the responses. So those will all be posted, they'll all be recorded, and they'll all be available online. But unfortunately, no other outside resources will be available besides those office hours. We do have other supportive resources on our program webpage, though. So there is a pretty lengthy list of decarbonization strategy types by the property type. There is a list of supportive financial resources in addition to this program. There's resources for how to manage and mitigate waste, or embodied carbon that comes from these projects. So there is other resources written available, but there won't be any other meetings available. So for the planning phase applications, would the ERA conducted by the state be the ASHRAE level 2 equivalent assessment, or are they separate portions? So they are separate. So the ERA is very similar to an ASHRAE level 2, but it focuses primarily on decarbonization measures. So not necessarily energy efficiency or payback, but on the actual decarbonization and reduction potential from each of those identified measures. An ASHRAE level 2 can be an eligible measure that you request funding for from the planning phase, but it doesn't have to be. So it could be just mechanical or electrical design and engineering as well. An update about Energize Denver and BPC compliance. So I can talk pretty loosely about this, and then Julia, if you want to jump in if I miss anything, feel free, please. So as many of you are aware, there was an update this past legislative session that allows for deemed compliance between a local jurisdiction's building performance standard and the state's building performance standard. So if there is a local jurisdiction that has a building performance standard that is as stringent or more stringent than the state's, then they could be deemed compliant with the state's requirements. So for Denver and their Energize Denver program, this means that you would report on your EUI target and benchmark, and you would be deemed compliant as long as you achieve that target with the state's targets. So folks that want to apply for this but are also covered under Energize Denver will still have to select a GHG reduction target. So under Energize Denver, they require a EUI target. And so in order to be in compliance with both and be able to receive funding, you would have to have that EUI target for Denver and then select that GHG target for the state. So you'd have to report on and achieve 2 different targets for both programs. So a little complicated, but it is still possible for those folks to get funding. From the date of award notification, projects must be completed within 12 months. So it's not from the date of award notification, it'll be from the date of contracting. So from the date that you are under contract and have signed that agreement between the state and the awarded organization, within 12 months of that date is when all projects need to be complete. We recognize that there may be unforeseen circumstances that come up. So like supply chain issues or labor issues that we could potentially, reassess if needed on a case by case basis. But largely all projects will need to be complete within 12 months, and that will be stated in the contract. Okay, so eligibility criteria for HVAC system upgrade grant, specifically, this person would like to know what the general requirements are and whether financial institutions such as banks and credit unions would be eligible to apply. So, a bank or a credit union would be able to apply if they were the property owner of a building, but they cannot apply for and receive funding to pass on to someone else. So there, we won't allow for pass-through funding for any lenders to apply and receive the grant themselves. The person who is spending the money and installing the equipment and making the upgrades on site will be the person to be awarded funding and be contracted with the CEO. But in terms of other HVAC criteria for eligibility, if it can be tied to emissions reductions on site, then we would allow it as an eligible cost. Is round two just the implementation phase, or is it a completely different pool of funds with different criteria? So round two will have similar criteria. The criteria may change based on what we learned from this first round or updates that we need to make to the RFA. But it will be just the implementation phase of this grant, just in the next round. So this person noticed that geothermal is not allowed during the planning phase, but wanted to confirm the purchase or installation of geothermal would be allowed during the implementation phase. Yes, so geothermal feasibility studies, test wells, anything that you have to do prior to the actual implementation or construction is not eligible. But the purchase and installation of geothermal is an eligible implementation phase cost. And that's to prevent a lot of quality assurance requirements that can be triggered once we're using environmental information or collecting environmental data. So we're not allowing any of those feasibility studies or test wells as eligible costs. So it's important to know that if you plan on doing a test well prior to drilling and implementing the geothermal project, that has to be completed before you receive funding. So that test well has to be completed prior to receiving funding, ideally along with the application. This slide deck will be available on our website. I believe it is already on our program webpage. So again, if you go to the program webpage and down to the RFA materials, it is within a subfolder there. Can bonds be used in conjunction with the grant or to demonstrate funding readiness? Yes. So we don't have a lot of qualifiers on what can be considered leveraged funds, as long as you're able to meet that gap in funding. So since we're covering 50 to 65%, as long as you're able to demonstrate that you're covering 35 to 50%, it can be from generally whatever funding sources available. That there is a slight exception. We are not able to use other federal funds for this, since this will be a federally funded program. We don't want to have any duplication of funds. And then can I repeat the number of anticipated awardees? Absolutely. So we anticipate having a maximum of 10 planning phase awardees in this first round. And then we'll have $10 million available for implementation phase awardees. We estimate that there will be awards ranging from $500,000 to $2 million. So could be as little as 5 awardees and maybe a maximum of 10 awardees in that phase for this first round. And then depending on the level of interest we receive and the awards we give out will impact what we have available in the next round. I think that's all the ones that I'm able to answer now. I know there's a few about the emissions factors and the technical resource guide updates for the BPS program. Those updates are coming about the resource guide and clarification on the emissions factors that are used. But that Julia, I don't know if you want to add anything other than we'll follow up with additional information once we have that.
Yeah, we're hoping for a mid to late October release for the technical resource guide. Sorry for that delay, but it's just taking a little bit longer than anticipated to update all the language with the new legislation and whatnot. But thanks for your patience, and hopefully this next version will be a lot more thorough and answer any outstanding questions.
I don't think I missed anything. Did you see any others that I
There's
should
some in the chat.
Oh, okay, in the
Some of
chat.
them we've already answered those.
Gotcha. I think someone has a question about funding. If the technical guidance is not available by November 1st, that's okay. I would still recommend that you apply. The technical guidance will impact how you're able to change your target selection. So it doesn't impact your ability to apply. It'll just impact how and when you're able to select that reduction target type. And then will the funding for the June application be the same as this first round? So we won't have as much funding available in that second round. We do have a majority of the funding slated to be available in this current round. So yeah, but it will be the same funding source, both under CPRG from the EPA, both with those federal requirements.
And no planning.
And no planning phase. Yeah, correct. Where are the applications found on the Beam site? So the applications are not on Beam. The applications are on the Colorado Energy Office's site. So I would recommend, Julia, if you wouldn't mind dropping it in the chat, that would be super helpful. But if you can Google Large Building Decarbonization Showcase Colorado, it is the first one that pops up. And then you can scroll down to a section that outlines where to find the application materials and guidance. And then you'll request an application folder from myself and drop all of your materials in there. Do implementation costs already incurred qualify for the program? So no costs incurred or work that is started prior to being under contract with the energy office are eligible for reimbursement. So anything that has already been incurred, work that has already started, up until you sign a contract. So not just receive the award notification, but sign a contract with the office, all of those costs are ineligible. And we have a few about the emissions factors, and that we'll follow up with a more detailed answer there. Can efficiency work such as HVAC controls, lighting, completed before the grant application count towards a 25% requirement for public buildings? Yes, so any work that you've done that is both $500,000 or more and impacts 25% of the building would trigger that BPS target. For buildings that are less than 50,000 square feet, so someone says their building is 44,555 square feet, this is not an eligible property type because it is not a covered building under Building Performance Colorado. So by statute, not my definition, not our office's definition, but by statute, a covered building has to be 50,000 square feet. And there's a few exceptions and exemptions. Sounds like someone might have an issue downloading the RFA. If you want to give me an email, I can send it to you as well. But it should all be accessible through our Google Drive. But if you're having trouble accessing the Google Drive, I can send you a direct link that might work, or just send you the files themselves. Does decentralization from the Denver steam loop count as building level decarbonization, and would that be eligible? So yeah, I think that that would definitely qualify you as an eligible project type. As long as you're able to demonstrate any work that's done and connect it to the BPS GHG reduction target. So not just the Energize Denver EUI target, but the GHG reduction target from the state. And how you plan to achieve that, and alongside decentralization would be an eligible use of funds. Round two will open in summer of next year, so we don't have an exact date yet. It will be dependent on how quickly our planning phase applicants can complete their funded measures and move on to the implementation phase. But we're shooting for summer of 2026 to open and communicate that to you guys. Okay, can an applicant apply and potentially be awarded both a large building decarbonization grant and a Sitco tax credit, or the programs mutually exclusive? So that would be a really great combination of funds to use. So either the GetCo tax credit or the Sitco tax credit offered by our office. So those are state tax credits. And there's no conflict there of using both of those funding sources, and they can both overlap pretty neatly. The recording of the webinar will be available online, as well as a transcript. So that will be posted in the subfolder in the RFA, linked on the building webpage, and it will also be posted to YouTube with captions for folks that would like to access it after today. And similar with all of our office hours, so all of the office hours will be recorded and posted both to our program webpage folder as well as our YouTube with captions along with the slides. Okay.
There's no few more questions back. Q&A.
The Q&A. Let's see if I can get a couple more. Um, so I think for the remaining Q&A questions, we will have to follow up with additional details since they reference the emissions factors, and then similar to the campus question. But so building envelope upgrades are not currently allowed. I don't anticipate them being allowed in a future round. But yeah, I would wait until that round 2 RFA comes out, and that's when we'll have a better idea of what costs will be available for you to request funding from for that future round, but for this one, they're not eligible. And then, yeah, all of the requirements for both phases, so for planning funding and for implementation funding, all of that's listed in the RFA. So on the program webpage, broken out by phase, by eligibility, by disallowed cost, by potential project types. So I would give those a read, and then if you have additional questions, you can always submit a question or email me with a question. And I can answer them, and those questions, all the questions that I get either on here or through our question submission will be made available. And our last few minutes, here's my email address. You can send me questions if you're having trouble accessing or getting to any of the materials. And then we have our program webpage, the RFA and application materials, the BPC webpage, and all of those associated materials. A way to submit a question, check your covered building status, and check your BPC compliance are all found on this last page of the slides. The slides are all currently on our BPC, our program webpage. So at that large building decarbonization showcase webpage, as well as how to submit a question. But Yeah, thank you guys so much. All of our updated FAQs will be posted, they're posted on Friday of every week by 5 p.m. So look for the answers to all the questions we received here at that time. And if you have any other questions that come up, feel free to reach out to me or submit a question. Or again, we'll have office hours every Monday from 11:30 to 12:30.